As you know, I tend to be a very hopeful person, at least for the most part. And as long as I have remembered, since I was a child, I would uh, look at negative things that are happening and try to see the silver lining and the thing that would make things better in the moment and in the future. And that would help me cope with things in general. And from my interactions with you, I feel like you have a very different perspective on hope, that you are more on the realistic side and you see things directly as they are when they are happening instead of trying to find the bits of positivity. But maybe I am wrong here. What is your perspective on hope in general?
If we're talking about me as a person, I have tendencies. So technically, I'm a mixture of both. I'm someone who's actually hopeful, and sometimes I'm too hopeful for my own good. But at the same time, I am a realist.
Yeah.
So I can, I usually tend to keep a little bit of distance from my hope and realize that I'm being hopeful in the situation. I'm setting expectations and so on and so on and so on. And that's where my realist comes in. That like my natural tendencies are a hopeful person, but then comes my realist's inner self that I've come to be that kind of holds back my hopefulness.
So realist side is something that was taught, you will learn
That came with time, with my experience in a lot of different areas of life. But I tend to be on the natural side, like naturally I'm more of a hopeful person.
So maybe you are more similar in that regard than I initially thought. Because I did think that you're more nihilistic in general.
I don't let my, like I said, like my realism or my realistic personality, if you want to call it, it kind of like semi blocks my hopefulness.
Okay.
Not in a negative way, but it kind of helps me keep a big distance between what's going on, what's actually happening, and how are my hopeful tendencies toward the matter. So I'm always able to keep a distance from my hope and still able to analyze situations and matters from a distance of my hope and my emotions because of my realist tendencies as well that I've learned or I adapted through time.
But is it because you see hope as like that it leads to disappointments because of these high expectations? Do you think that is why you develop this realistic side of
Not
viewing things?
necessarily. It goes back to. Here we go again.
Are we going on a tangent?
It's a quote from an anime that I watched. Don't remember which anime, don't ask me. But the quote goes like, hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can build nations and hope can destroy nations.
Sure.
Or you can take the other quote from Shawshank Redemption. It's a very old movie. It's whatever, doesn't matter. And he says that hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can drive a man insane. So that just describes how hope is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
At least that's how I look at it.
Sure.
Hope can help you maintain a positive outlook and a positive inner energy on what's going on.
Yeah.
But at the same time, when you are too hopeful, especially, you tend to have really high expectations of yourself, of your surroundings, and of what's going on as well. And these high expectations are nothing but expectations because they are just ideas in your head. And as we know, ideas don't really exist.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where my realism kicks in and where it also came from when I started realizing, okay, like my expectations got nothing to do with reality. My expectations are just like, just like when I say, for example, like by the end of this year, I am going to be financially independent. That's just expectations of myself, you know. That's my hopeful.
That's not only hopeful. That's more you're going more on the extreme side of hope, where it's unrealistic, like extremely unrealistic.
That's kind of my natural state of like, okay, I'm gonna have really high expectations. I'm gonna be really extremely hopeful about stuff, and I'm gonna put in the work. And then when I realize that, okay, you're not being really a realist here. You're going, you know, you're kind of taking stuff that are outside of your control, and you're setting expectations of yourself that you're going to be able to control the uncontrollable. And within a certain amount of time, you're going to be able to achieve this or be this or do that. And that's where my realism started coming in. And that's where it even came in the first place, where I started realizing that my hope is a double-edged sword. Even though I know that for the most part, it helps me push through a lot of hardships. At the same time, when I don't manage to do the undoable, let's call it like this, it's just not my expectations that get crushed, but my sense of hope as well. And that's where I started being, or that's where my realism tendencies started coming in. And I guess there's sort of a mixture between coping defense mechanism, and at the same time, they're just about taking things the way they are. So we've talked about in previous episodes how to take people at face value, and how to take situations at face value, instead of trying to build that specific image of them in your head and maybe have some expectations. And with time, I've come to, you know, again, going back to my realism, it starts coming back in when I started realizing that, okay, my expectations and reality and the way that my hope can paint a completely different image of the situation that I'm in and of the people that I'm with in my brain. That realization made me become a bit more realist and trying to take things more at face value, while as well maintaining hope for the future based on the equivalent of how things are at face value.
Sure.
Does that make sense? It's a little bit.
It does. It's like a mixture. It's like a mixture
in my head, because I know that the timeline of how things went through it makes a lot of sense for me. But when I'm describing it for other people, there's usually a little bit of hardships, because for me, the way that it went and the way that I've come to this point, it just makes sense, you know. So it's also related to philosophy, you know. When we're talking about human beings when we're talking about a human being observing the world and just taking things as the way they are and letting nature take its natural course, you know, that's kind of being a realist.
It's not necessarily being a realist. It's just they're not necessarily thinking about it as being.
Exactly.
Like you're just being. There is no thought process that is happening in the moment. So I think it's a little bit different, because we go back to the idea that we don't even know what reality and realism is. So just a concept in our head, what we think reality is. But I think for children it's different, because they are not thinking about these concepts. They are just being in this existence, whether this is reality or not. They're just being in it and going with the flow of it. So for me, that example doesn't work necessarily, but I do get what you're trying to say.
You can look at it like, there's also that concept, for example, in philosophy, and I think if I'm not mistaken, I've heard it from Alan Watts as well, where he goes on about talking about how when you start taking things the way they are at face value, start realizing how little they matter and how they're not really any important role. So, for example, let's take when you're looking from the top of the mountain at nature or at a city, you know, you're just viewing it. You're just enjoying the view, enjoying the nature, maybe the sun, a nice autumn breeze, whatever you want to call it. When you look at it in a realist way and at face value, it's just you standing there staring at the object. And it's just that a sun is hitting you, and there's just some wind that you're feeling on your skin because of our sensor abilities, if you want to call them like that. So, to be honest, it's really, you know, it's not like you're doing anything important. It's just like when you're listening to a song, you're just listening to somebody talking. They're just saying words in a specific rhythm, you know. But when you are in the moment, and when you're starting to lose yourself in the moment, and you're allowing yourself to lose yourself in the moment, you start noticing, you start having emotions, and you start connecting these things to your inner perspective, to happiness, joy, sad, heartbreak, whatever you want to call it. And that's when they start having a meaning for you. It's the same when you're being a realist and you're looking at things just for the way they are, the situation that you're in, then it doesn't have any meaning. But when you're starting to connecting it to emotions, aka in this situation, hope, that's when they start having a bit more of power in you, and you become able to lose yourself in the experience.
Yeah. But that's the thing I wanted to go on about that. I think you can be a realist and a hopeful person at the same time, because when you describe your own experience, it makes me realize that I am in general a very realistic person about when things are happening, when someone is dying, that the conclusion of wars. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in religions. I don't believe in stories. I just try to see things as they are happening, but at the same time, I build up these thoughts that things can get better, because they will get better based on history. There are times where there's suffering, there's pain, and times of peace and prosperity. And you can say the same thing about your personal experience. You'll have downfalls and stages of pain and suffering, and there will be stages where you'll be happy and thriving and improving. So it is realistic. And for me, since I was a child, this was like a coping mechanism to cope with bad things that are happening around me. Like, I don't know, kids bullying me at school, or even small thing like losing money on the streets. And I would say, okay, I would try to find scenarios in the future that would make me feel about this bad experience in the moment, that things will improve, things will change, and I will get back what I lost. And I would just focus on these narratives instead of the other narratives that would say, oh, I'm going to lose more. I'm going to be beaten up even more. I'm going to be bullied more. No, I would just focus on the positive, because, I mean, both might happen. Both are realistic. But what are you trying to focus on? Which side, I guess? So I do think you can be a realist and a hopeful person. It just depends on perspective. And like, hope can be unrealistic. Like in your example, when you said about financial freedom in a certain pursuit in a very short period of time, that's not just hopeful anymore. It's more, is delusional the word here, or more like it is possible, but it is very,
In my scenario, I wouldn't really say it's delusional. And I'm not up talking myself here, just for the sake of clarity. But because there was a process that was going on a few years in advance before I said, hey, okay, I'm going to be financially independent by the end of this year. There was already a process that was going on before that. It's not really delusional. I would say it's a little bit more naive, maybe naive.
That was the word.
Because in that moment when I was being extremely hopeful, of course, I was undermining the whole process of things that still has to be done before I can get to that point. The steps, exactly. And delusional is when you are just starting with a business right now, and you just go like, okay, in 2 months my business is gonna make me millions. That's when you're.
It's like stages of unrealistic things.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe delusional is a bit more extreme when you're like, I am the best guy in the world. I am the most handsome. Like you're delusional.
So when I look at it like when there's
a fine line between being delusional and.
It's not just this. It depends whether like there is or there has been already some steps, some mini goals, some calculations, behind your hope. Then it's not delusional. It is sort of it's like maybe very minimum level of delusion.
But you're still tied to realism, because you notice the steps that
Because when you come up to this conclusion that okay, in this amount of time I'm gonna be able to do this and this, or I'm gonna achieve this and this, the calculations were based on everything that you've done so far.
Yeah, exactly.
And it just thought like, I'm gonna start hitting the gym today for the first time in my entire life, and in 2 months I'm gonna have the best body ever. That's when you're delusional,
Yeah.
Of course, unless you're taking steroids, then that might change things a little bit. But we're talking about just like in general, natural situation. And if you're gonna go back to realism and hope as well, the example that I was talking about before, when you're losing yourself in the experience or not, And based on what you've said so far, and also based on my own experience, to be honest, I would make the assumption that people tend to start at one end of the spectrums. So they're either too realists or they're too hopeful. Now I'm even connecting more dots. Look at this. You can also take the example of the clock that goes to an extreme, goes to the other, and then comes back in the middle. When you are too realist, technically, when you are too realistic, then you are a nihilistic person as well. And when you start, exactly, it is. It just goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
And when you start holding yourself back, sorry, not holding yourself back, but putting a little bit of distance between you and your realistic perspective, and you start learning how to lose yourself in the moment and allow yourself the emotions to come in the moment, that's when you start building hope as well.
I do think that
You start getting expectations, and when you are too hopeful, you start
you're
putting
going on the other end.
Exactly. You just start putting
It
some
is once again about the balance in a way. You know?
again, which is why the clock example. You know,
Like,
it's gonna go in this direction, then it's gonna come back in this direction, and then slowly it's gonna
I
find
feel like
its
it's one
balance.
of these things that everyone should develop, to have a little bit hope in life, because hope gives you motivation and will make you want to pursue your goals. You know, like if you don't have this hope, then there's a lot of things you're gonna think about that might stop you from trying to pursue the things that you want in life. Like, okay, but maybe tomorrow this will happen, this war will start, or things that could happen anytime. Like you could die any moment, wars could start at any second, you could lose all your money, all your belongings. They're all possible, but they might also not happen. So what do you try to focus on? What are you trying to think about? You can keep these things in mind. I think about death every day. I think about losing everything every single day, but I don't put too much emotional weight on these thoughts. You know what I mean? I don't focus on them. Like they come to me, I think about them, but I don't put too much weight on them. Or they don't put too much weight on me. If that makes more sense. So I focus more on the things that I want to focus on right now in the moment, the things that I'm trying to work on, and that they are possible, that they could happen. I just gotta do what, take action. I just feel like in general, in my opinion, it is better to be extremely hopeful than being extremely nihilistic, because at least if you're extremely hopeful, then you're gonna enjoy some things in your life. But if you're extremely nihilistic, then you're gonna be depressed all the time. Like I did have phases in my life where I was very nihilistic and depressed, but at least I had this little glimpse of hope that kept me going. So I can't imagine people who don't have that hope whatsoever. I think these are the people who eventually decide to end their lives, and they just completely give up because they lost all hope. And I think
not necessarily,
just thinking in general.
Because if we're talking about people who are actually nihilistic, not like your average type of nihilism, but someone who's actually nihilistic and realists, they wouldn't really connect anything in the world with their emotions. So they wouldn't really have negative emotions about stuff. They would just take things at face value.
I don't think that's necessarily true, because
if we're talking about like pure realism and pure nihilism, then that's how. Okay, maybe that's okay. Again, maybe that's just the fine line.
Category who are people who don't connect with their emotions in general.
But if we're talking about realism here, because I define realism as, if you're listening to a song, you're just listening to someone who's speaking words. You know what I mean? Nihilism.
But this is realism outside the human experience, because this is you can't detach yourself from these.
You could. You can. For how long? I don't know. But I guess that there could be a trigger in everybody's life where they would start, looking at things just pure.
We have moments.
Look at it. Take geniuses as an example.
Yeah.
They don't know how to deal with their emotions. And when I'm talking about genius, I'm talking about people with like really high IQ.
Yeah, sure.
People who are really low in the EQ.
More the thinking side.
Exactly. So they usually have a huge distance between them and their emotions. And they usually look at things just, let's take Sheldon Cooper example from Big Bang Theory, The way he talks in the beginning of this series, of course, later on in the show, he becomes a little bit more emotional, or he learns how to deal and how to identify his emotions. But in the beginning, He's looking at things for the most part objectively without any emotions, you know. And that could be that's how I would define realism. Now, being nihilistic is, I don't know which one is the subgenre of which, to be honest. But being nihilistic is a little bit different, because being nihilistic is like you're looking at the negatives in the world more than the positives, and that's where that could lead to suicide.
But see, that's why nihilism isn't necessarily realism.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's not realistic,
So,
because the world has good and bad.
There's
There is a coloration, but I don't think they are like, you don't have to be realistic to
Okay,
be nihilistic.
That's a better definition or explanation of,
So
how they are.
that's why when I see it, like these extreme geniuses, they could be very objective, they could be very realistic, but it doesn't mean they're nihilistic.
Yeah.
There is a lot of scientists who lived a good life and they enjoyed their lives and they were even hopeful in their lives. It just, I think there is a correlation, but we can't like tie them completely together.
Yeah.
Like you could be both, you know.
Yeah.
There is like if you are someone who is
They
extremely
kind of-
realistic, you could be.
It's like nihilism and realism. I would describe them in the way that they are two different sides of the same coin.
Sure.
You know, there's like really fine line that differentiate between whether you are being nihilistic or you're being realistic, and that would be kind of your
I don't think
the emotions, the connection that you've got with
Yeah.
with what's going on.
But I don't think there's anybody in the world who is 100% realistic, because we are still creatures who care about stories, and stories are not realistic. Like even our past experiences and our memories, we think that we know exactly what happened at that moment, but every time we think about the memory, we basically recreating that story and changing certain lines about it. And over time, it just becomes this fading thing that we hang tightly on, even though if we actually go back to that moment, it's probably completely different.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, definitely.
the way it happened, how we felt in the moment, it's just
It's kind of the story that you tell
we
yourself.
just
I
keep
guess.
telling story. That's why we like stories. We like movies. We like TV shows. We like novels and telling stories to each other, and like it's a core thing to the human experience. So we can't be 100% realistic, but you could be someone who is extremely hopeful or extremely nihilistic, independent of your realism, I guess.
Kind of just wanted to go back to that point
Yeah.
because that was the original point before we went on.
I think the point is hope good or bad? But
Yeah.
I think hope, in general, hope is better than being nihilistic, no matter the circumstances. Being hopeful can push you forward more than being
It's better than nihilism, but
Yeah.
now
It is
now is it better than realism? Since we've started differentiating between nihilistic and
Can
realistic,
we really subtract them? I don't think we can take
You
hope
kind of-
out of realism.
because you can call someone a realist, and they could still be a full functioning human being, who are able to do stuff.
Yeah.
But when you're calling somebody a nihilistic person, then they're kind of just
They're not gonna
stuck
be
in that. They're not going to be functioning that well.
It's a very negative trait.
Exactly. That's a huge difference. So we know that hope is better than nihilism. But which, so is being too hopeful better than being too realistic? I think that's where to be honest, I don't think
It's not easy to answer.
I don't think that's something that you can compare and decide. Because technically, it depends on your goal. Because in some scenarios, or in some specific courses of actions, being a realistic is better. Being a realistic person is better than being someone who's too hopeful. But in some other scenarios, being hopeful type is better than being realist. And I think that's where we get it. At least that's where my brain would go back to the yin and yang. At least that's what's going on in my
At
brain.
least when you're comparing being hopeful with being nihilistic, it
is
very yin and yang
exactly.
scenario. Like
even with realism, I would still take it as yin and yang, because technically, if there is no hope in the world, then there is realistic or nihilism, which are kind of similar. And if there is no realistic, or if there's no nihilism in the world, then the realism in the world would also go down, and then hope would start dominating everything. So it's like kind of you need
a
mixture of both.
Sure. There wouldn't be hope if there is no nihilism. Like if you don't see people who don't have hope, you wouldn't understand what being hopeful means. It's like you can take that to any scenario basically. But once again, I think you can be a very realistic person, but also very hopeful.
Definitely.
Being hopeful is not an objective thing. It's just about where your thoughts are going, the scenarios you build for the future.
I would take myself as an example here. Like I said, like I'm a quite hopeful person, but at the same time, as I grew older and older, I became also more realistic, which is when like when I'm being too hopeful, that's when my realism would kick in and
hit the brakes
and give me a distance between me and my hope. You know
when to hit the brakes on the
for the most part. For the most part, luckily I am able to hit the brakes.
Being realistic is a tool to hit the brakes on your natural side, which is being hopeful when you meet a new person, when you start a new job,
trying to find the balance or something.
It's an interesting way of seeing.
It's because I feel like going back to that same quote, hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can build and hope can destroy nations. When you're too hopeful about something, and I'm just repeating myself here, you have too many expectations.
And you're gonna be disappointed.
And it's not just disappointed. It depends on the kind of expectations and depends on the goals that you've got. And it depends on the image that you've got of yourself as well. It's too many factors at hand here.
Yeah.
And then when you but when you don't manage to make that hope a reality, most people, at least even in my own experience, you would have a existential crisis.
Sure.
Because, it's not just that, that we cannot...
When reality hits you.
We did not manage to make that goal a reality, which was extremely hopeful and semi-delusional. And then that goal that you've got, or that expectations that you've got yourself, is connected to who you are, to a part of you that want to make that a reality. And then that fails, and then in a natural way, you start questioning as well the part of you that wanted to be this, or wanted to become this, or wanted to achieve this or that. And then if that leads to a spiral of events or similar events happening, or expectations getting broke, you end up in a really nasty existential place where you're questioning who you are, you're questioning your existence, your personality,
and you could lose all hope in that moment.
And then that would lead you to being kind of nihilistic, which I guess, and now that I'm saying this out loud, I guess that's where you have the idea that I'm someone who's nihilistic and maybe too realistic, because in the past, right now I'm talking about my experience, in the past, when I was being too hopeful and I didn't really know how to hit the brakes on that, and I would end up more often than not in this spiral of negativity, and then I would go on the other side of the spectrum, which is I'm being completely nihilistic about the world and about myself and about life.
Doing the opposite
exactly.
Of what we usually do.
So hope is good.
Hope is dangerous, but hope is good. If
but
that makes
you
sense.
Need to know how to put, not just hit the brakes, but also keep the distance between you and your thoughts, your expectations, where you're going with a lot of things.
Like, I'll give you a bad example. If you're trying to pursue someone and you think that they're interested in you, but they are not, and you keep pursuing them for years and years for that glimpse of hope that you will be with them one day. I think that's a dangerous hope. That's where hope is not good, because you're being unrealistic. Because objectively, realistically, this person is not interested in you, but you keep wasting time year after year trying to pursue this individual.
And as time goes on, like if you're talking about a bigger horizon of time, your expectations are gonna get higher and higher.
Because you invested more time.
Exactly, because you're gonna start thinking like, oh, when that day comes, whether we're talking about relationship here or we're talking about financial goals, when that day comes, we're gonna be so madly in love, or I'm gonna be a billionaire, or I'm gonna be this and this, and then the expectations, they just go higher and higher, and they don't know the sky is the limit.
It's like a drug. Like hope is like a drug in a sense, and the more you pursue this idea, this hopeful idea that's unrealistic, the bigger the crash will be after. It's really like a drug in a sense. Yeah, so I think that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that we will see you in the next episode.
See you in the next one.